So for a change, I thought this week I'd talk about legato and two different approaches to legato that have developed over the years. So the first one is what I call the traditional technique. It's a technique that I was taught when I was first learning to play the guitar. It's the approach that you learn when you're playing the classical guitar, for example. And then the second technique is much more an electric guitar technique. It's hammer-on only. It's a technique that was popularised by people like Alan Holdsworth and Brett Garsed. So let's define some terms. Let me demonstrate what I mean by the traditional technique. So by the traditional approach, I mean a combination of hammer-ons and pull-offs. So what you tend to do is pluck a string to give it energy, and then as you ascend up the neck, you'd hammer on to the next note. And then descending, you'd pull your finger off. And typically this approach is loud enough for the acoustic guitar. Certainly this was the approach I learnt when I first learnt the classical guitar, for example. Okay, now let me demonstrate what I mean by hammers-on only. So as the name suggests, with this technique, all you're doing is using hammer-ons, irrespective of whether you're ascending, descending or changing strings. The technique's exactly the same, you're just hammering on. So it doesn't have the same volume as a traditional approach, but it has a consistency in sound because you're using the same technique to play every note. So I find it interesting over the years that I've been playing the guitar. It's interesting how terminology has changed. So originally I would have referred to this as slurring. Slurring being the technique where you're changing notes just using the left hand and it doesn't involve picking every note. Whereas legato is a musical term which is defined by notes that are smoothly connected together, as opposed to staccato where the notes are distinct and very short. But over the years, certainly in guitar terminology, when people talk about legato, they're talking about this technique, not necessarily the musical definition of that term. Anyway, what I thought would be interesting is if I broke these two techniques down and compared one with the other. So let's start with the most obvious difference. The most obvious difference is when you're playing a descending line on one string. So let's compare the two techniques there. So with the traditional technique, you'd play the original note, but you'd also plant another finger down, which is the target note that you're aiming for. And you pull off that first note and land on that second note, so you get this kind of sound. And the finger's just snapping sideways, effectively just plucking the string. With the second technique, the approach is a little bit more complicated because you hammer on the first note, because you're doing hammer-ons only, and then you need to release that note so the string can come away from the neck, and simultaneously you're hammering on with the next note. And the coordination, the difficulty here is getting that coordination right so the string can come away from the neck, because if you release too late, then you don't hear the hammer-on of the second string. See if I can, there. You get this kind of very weak sound. So you need to allow the string to come away from the neck, but obviously you don't want to leave it too long because you want nice connected notes, not staccato notes. Okay, so that's descending. What about ascending? They're both hammers-on, so you'd expect them both to be identical to each other, but there are some subtle differences between them. Let me see if I can demonstrate. So the main difference between the two techniques is how you set up for the next set of notes, and it's about an economy of movement. So if you think about the first technique, the traditional technique, you play your first note, you hammer on the next note, you hammer on your third note. But traditionally, you'd keep your fingers planted. So the first finger plays the first note, I'll leave it planted while the second finger's hammering on, I'll leave that planted while the third finger's hammering on, just so I can do these kinds of lines with an economy of movement. So my first finger's staying connected to the neck all the time, it's staying planted in place. The second finger is planted in place for the duration of the second and third notes, and then the third finger hits down to play that third note. So that's how you get an economy of movement when you're doing the traditional approach. If you're just using hammer-ons, then you always need to be thinking about releasing the note in order to play the next note. And the reason is, if you're doing something like a trill, your finger needs to be away from the neck in order to hammer on that first note again. So you're very much less likely to leave fingers planted on the neck when you're playing a hammers-on only approach. Okay, finally let's talk about changing strings. So with the traditional technique, you normally play the note to get the string vibrating, and then you use the legato, the hammer-on and pull-on to play the remaining notes. With a hammers-on only technique, it's much more about just the hammer-on to make the string vibrate. And it's interesting, this is one of those techniques which is really quite difficult to master when you're first learning to play. But you find, as an approach, it becomes much more straightforward to just use hammer-ons when you're playing consecutive notes than it is to try and coordinate the left and the right hand through a series of legato lines. So it's one of those strange techniques that starts off harder. The second technique starts off harder than the first technique, but as you master it, you find that it becomes easier to use that second technique than it does the first. So, when I contrast the two then, the traditional technique tends to be louder because you tend to hit the string to start it vibrating. It tends to be more stable as well. Certainly if you're playing a gig, if you're jumping around, because your hand is planted, because your fingers are planted on the neck much more in the first technique, you're not going to jar your hand away. Whereas if you're using a hammers-on only technique, your fingers are much more floating above the neck, so you can't move around quite as much if you're using the second technique. The first technique tends to give you a variation in sound because you're using the combination of three techniques in order to play an ascending line versus a descending line versus changing strings. Whereas if you're doing hammers-on only, it's quieter, but the technique is more consistent as you move around the neck. Also, interestingly, the second technique, when you get it, it seems to be harder to pick up, but once you get it, you feel much more freedom, or I feel much more freedom when I'm using the second technique. My hand just feels like it's floating over the neck much more. And interestingly, changing strings seems to be that much more straightforward with the second technique because you're just using hammers-on. You're not having to sort of coordinate picking notes and then dropping into a legato and then picking and then dropping. And you really notice that with things like, I don't know, a descending group of three, for example, where you're playing 3, 3, you're changing strings, so you have to pluck there and then pluck, pluck. So hopefully you can see you're sort of having these little bursts of where you've got to pluck 3 notes and then you're back to doing a legato technique if you're using the traditional technique. If you're doing hammers-on only, then everything's a hammer-on, and that kind of simplifies things. So if you want to experiment with this, what I'd recommend you doing is just start with, say, some simple trills between 2 notes. Get the feel of it right, between pairs of fingers as well. And certainly if you're doing the hammers-on only, get the hang of lifting your finger and then hammering on and getting the timing right between the two. So you're lifting the finger just as the finger's hammering on, but work on that, certainly work on those descending lines so every note is nice and clear, and you don't sort of muffle the second note because you've left the first note finger down too long. So those are the kinds of areas that I'd start with. I'd start with some very simple lines, start with just some trills between fingers. And then maybe in the coming weeks I'll give you some real exercises to develop these techniques further. So I'll chat next time anyway. Goodbye.